There's been a recent uptick in attacks on Jewish Americans as the public becomes increasingly invested in the conflict between Israel and Palestine.
Journalist and co-founder of Inquire More, Zaid Jilani, joins us now to discuss what exactly is going on here. Zaid, it's great to have you as always.
Good to see you, Zaid.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
What do we know about this potential spike in anti-Semitic violence?
Yeah, so I think we saw a number of incidents over the past week. Largely, they were at demonstrations, right? There was a large pro-Israel demonstration, and there was also a pro-Palestinian demonstration in New York City. And there were also some events in Los Angeles. And in both cases, I think what you saw was largely protest-related violence, right? You saw fights break out. It did seem to be fairly one-sided. I think that there were probably more people who were hurt on the pro-Israeli side. There was also an incident in Los Angeles where I believe there was a restaurant, and there seemed to be some Jewish people who were harassed and attacked. And I think that, unfortunately, what we saw over the past week is kind of an echo of what we saw, I think, over the past year, which is that there is certainly people involved in these political movements who I think personalize their differences with other people. And then they end up kind of, they end up using violence, personally demonizing people on the other side. And in this case, I think it did express itself through what would be deemed anti-Semitism at times, because the people who were considered most supportive of Israel by the people who were doing the attacks were Jewish people. There were also, by the way, a couple of mosques defaced. There was a mosque in New York City. Someone wrote "Death to Palestine" on it. And I think there was another one also in New York where something similar, some kind of vandalism happened. So yeah, it's really unfortunate to see this, because you have to remember, like, if you are involved in the peace movement in the United States, your goal is to get people who have been fighting each other for decades in a quite bloody conflict to get along with each other, to live in peace, right? So if you're engaged in violence here in the United States against people who really have nothing to do with the conflict, they have a point of view about it, and maybe they share a religious faith or ethnicity with some people who are in the conflict, but they have nothing to do with it. If you're fighting with those people, I think it's very counterproductive, right? And it's good that politicians, I think, are discouraging this now. It's good that city leaders are discouraging this. Ultimately, I don't think this is a wave of violence. I think the way it's being described is maybe a little bit alarmist. It seemed like it's a series of incidents, and police have been activated. I think a number of people were arrested in New York City in exchange for assaults, and I think there was someone like threw a firecracker or something as well. It's pretty bad. And I think that's the proper response. Politicians should discourage it. Civil society leaders should discourage it. And also, when people do this, they should be arrested. But I think people should understand that, like, tens of thousands of people demonstrated over the past week. Maybe, a few dozen people engaged in violence. So I don't think this is a core feature of any political movement, and I don't think it's being widely encouraged. But when the violence does break out, I do think people should do everything they can to discourage it.
Right. So Zaid, put it in perspective. How do we get out of this? Which is that we see this happen in demonstrations and more, and then one side media is like, see, this horrible thing is happening, and people are like, yes, but we also want to talk about this. You've seen this with the anti-Asian protests, but then I saw today. I think Li Fang of The Intercept reported that somebody says that discussing the lab leak theory is contributing to anti-Asian violence. That's ludicrous.
Yeah, I mean. That is something I wanted to discuss. So I think obviously anyone who's engaged in anything. So the core components of like political violence are anger, contempt, and disgust. So I think anyone who's engaging in that is going in the wrong direction. If you're demonizing, let's say, Jews, if you're demonizing Israelis, if you're attacking people on a personal level, I really think that's off base here. And that would be in the same case with the Asian stuff. I think if you were to make some disparaging remark about Chinese people, so on and so forth, I think that's way out of line. However, I don't think that this should curtail discussion about policy and discussion about like geopolitics, right? So I think there were a number of people who, as Lee had pointed out, there are people who suggested that if you believe that maybe COVID-19 did escape from a lab in Wuhan, it's a theory that's gained a lot of steam lately, that you're somehow contributing to hatred or violence. And not really. I mean, that's basically a search for the facts about what a government said about something, right? And I think on the right, I saw some people, and actually even 60 Minutes, or not 60 Minutes, Face the Nation, CBS, suggested this, and they're not even on the right, they're in the mainstream, that people who would maybe describe the situation, including Ocasio-Cortez, in parts of Israel as analogous to apartheid, like, for instance, what's happening in the West Bank, and the way the Palestinians are treated are analogous to apartheid. former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak said that if Israel does not create some settlement with the Palestinians, it's on the road to apartheid, right? Desmond Tutu, who was an anti-apartheid activist, black South African, has said it's analogous to apartheid, what he sees. That's an analysis of the situation and basically a critique of the government, saying the government should treat the Palestinians better. It's not meant to demonize Israel or Israelis or Jews, right? It's a protest of a situation, similarly to how the original anti-apartheid movement was not trying to demonize the Boers or the white South Africans. It was basically protesting the conditions placed upon black South Africans. And I think when people raise the apartheid analogy, they're basically protesting the conditions placed upon Palestinians, including things like land and displacement, evictions, unequal access to roads, water, resources, jobs, so on and so forth. I think that's going a bit too far. That's actually people weaponizing what happened in the past week to shut down legitimate criticism of a government. And I think both in the case of Asian violence and anti-Semitic violence, we obviously need to stand against those things. We need to stand against the demonization of people, against human beings, against ethnic groups and religious groups and national groups. But we don't need to curtail criticism of governments. I don't think the right has done that. I don't think the right is going to stop talking about Hamas rockets. They're going to stop talking about Iran funding the Palestinians because they're scared they may incite violence against those mosques or against Iranians or Palestinians. They're not applying the same rules to themselves as they're claiming that Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar. There are people on the right who called Ilhan Omar. They said that she's part of a Hamas caucus, right? I mean, that's pretty inflammatory if you really think about it. They're comparing her to a militant group or a paramilitary or a political organization that has a terror wing. So I think, I don't think the right is kind of playing 100% honest here when they're claiming that, really what Ocasio-Cortez said about Israel has been fairly measured in my view. Maybe she goes a little too far sometimes, but honestly, I don't think she's engaged in any kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric, any kind of demonizing of Israeli people. So I don't, as regrettable as these acts are, I don't think they should be used to shut down legitimate policy discussion, because ultimately we have to have policy discussion to shut down, to resolve the conflict, right?
Yes.
The conflict is what's tearing people apart. Of course, no amount of violence is justified and no amount of hatred is justified. But as long as you have hot conflicts, you're always going to see these fissures between people. And I think we really have to focus our diplomatic efforts on ending the conflict. And if we start saying that, we should lay off the Israeli government, we should lay off the Chinese government, things like that, by falsely claiming that criticisms of those governments are criticisms of people, then we may see these geopolitical issues continue to fester, and I think that'll only lead to more hatred in the future. So,
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Everyone should be capable of calling out anti-Semitic attacks, slurs, violence, without using those attacks to delegitimize an entire movement of people, most of whom are, in fact, peaceful and criticizing the Israeli government, not the Jewish people. Zaid, always great to have your voice on these issues.
Thank you, Zaid. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
Coming up, J.D. Scholten talks about how the Democratic Party is resonating or not with rural voters in some key battleground states when Rising returns.